Good afternoon. This is HTTP desync attack smashing into the cell next door with James Kettle. This is Islander FG, and welcome.
Good afternoon, and welcome to HTTP desync attacks smashing into the cell next door. Have you ever seen a system that was so complex it just had to be vulnerable? These days, we rely on layer upon layer of abstraction to have the faintest understanding of what's really going on with a website. And we tell people things like, HTTP is stateless, and you send one request, you get one response. But what if both of those were just kind of wrong? In this session, I'll share with you new tools and techniques to desynchronize complex systems, smash through the barriers around HTTP requests, and make websites rain exploits on their visitors. During some research last year, I came up with a theory, which was, if you're trying to select a topic to research, then the best topic is the one that makes you the most nervous. And this year I thought, okay, I'm going to try this theory out. So I asked myself, what topic am I really scared of? And the answer, for me personally, had to be HTTP request smuggling. I saw a DEF CON presentation on this a few years back called Hiding Rookies in HTTP, and it was a thrilling presentation, but for a number of reasons, it left me far too scared to actually tackle this topic myself. One of those reasons was that this technique was first documented way back in 2005, and yet I'd never seen anyone ever successfully apply this technique to a real website. Another was that some of the diagrams just made absolutely no sense to me because my technical understanding of the topic was just not there. And then there were some concerning statements on some of the slides. Things like, you will not earn any bounties using this technique. And even worse, you will certainly not be considered like a white hat if you try and find out if a single live website is actually vulnerable to this technique. So at the time, I thought, okay, I'm just going to leave that research well alone and forget it exists. But this year, I decided to try it out and see what happened. And, well, quite a few things happened. So I did manage to get some bounties. No one's called me a black hat for it so far. But I got quite a few interesting reactions from people. One guy was so surprised by the vulnerability I submitted to him, he thought I was actually faking the entire thing. He thought it was some kind of digital sleight of hand in order to trick him into paying me a bounty. And at the other end of the spectrum, another guy liked the unique technique that I used on his website so much, he thought he would take that technique and apply it to some other bug bounty sites behind my back to earn himself some pocket money. Now, of course, I had no idea he was doing this until he ran into a technical problem and decided that the way to resolve this was to pretend to be someone else and then email me asking for help, which didn't work out very well. But out of all of this chaos, I've been able to bring you safe detection methods so you can find these vulnerabilities without being called a black hat, all new methods to trigger desynchronization and exploit the results, and fresh methodology and tooling to bring clarity to a topic that's been overlooked for far too long. So first, I'm going to talk about what makes this attack possible, how to assess if a website is vulnerable and what to do next. Then I'll look at how to exploit it, all illustrated using case studies looking at real websites that I've exploited myself, starting with some really simple, easy ones, and then building in complexity, and finally ending with a live demo on a replica of a real system in which I'll also show how to use the open source Burp Suite extension that I'm releasing as part of this research. After that, I'll talk about how to prevent these attacks and then wrap up and take 5 minutes of questions. If you picture a website as an end user, it probably looks something like this, because as an end user, that's all that we can directly see. But behind the scenes, most modern websites are routing requests through a chain of servers speaking to each other over HTTP, over a stream-based transport layer protocol like TCP or TLS. And for the sake of performance, these TCP and TLS streams are heavily reused following the HTTP 1.1 Keep Alive protocol, which means the HTTP requests are placed back to back on the stream with no delimiters in between them, and each server in the chain is expected to parse the HTTP headers of each request to work out where one request stops and the next one starts. So you have requests from users from all over the world being funneled over a small pool of shared TCP streams to the backend application server, which is parsing these in order to understand where each one stops and the next one starts. It's pretty obvious what's going to go wrong, right? What happens if someone sends an ambiguous message? One where the front end thinks the message is a different length to the back end. So in this example, the front end is interpreting this as one request, so it's forwarding the whole thing onto the back end, and the back end, for some reason, thinks that the final blue square is the end of the request, and therefore it thinks the orange square is the start of the next request, and then it's just going to wait for that next request to be completed. And when the next real request hits the backend server, we end up with this orange data at the start of it. So that's the essence of request smuggling. We can apply an arbitrary prefix to the next request to hit the backend. Now, because we can't directly see what's happening behind the front end system, it's quite easy to get bogged down in the technical details. I certainly did myself, but ultimately, it's really that simple. So now let's zoom in and take a look at what the data might actually look like on the wire. This request is ambiguous because we're using an absolutely classic desynchronization technique. We've just specified the content length header twice. In this example, the front end is looking at the first content length header, so it's forwarding all the blue data and the orange G onto the back end. But the back end is looking at the second content length, so it's only reading in the blue data. It thinks the G is the start of the next request. So when the next request, which could be coming from the same user or a different user, hits the back end, they're going to get an unexpected response saying something like unknown method gpost. And that's it. We've successfully done a request smuggling attack. The only catch is this technique is so classic that it doesn't really work on anything that's actually worth hacking these days. What does work on plenty of interesting systems is using chunked encoding. So chunked encoding is an alternative way of specifying the length of the message. Instead of specifying a content length, you say transfer encoding chunked, and that means that the back-end server, or the front end, whatever the server is, will just parse the body of the message until it reaches a 0, followed by an empty line. So in this example here, once again, the front end has used the content length header. It's forwarded all the data up to and including the orange G, but the back end has looked at the content length, transfer encoding chunked, so it stopped reading in this message after the 0 and the new line. And once again, our victim is going to get an unknown method gpost response. Now, great, that technique's nice and it works on lots of systems, but what if the desynchronization happens the other way round? What if it's the front end that looks at the transfer encoding chunked header and the back end that uses the content length? Well, we can still exploit that. There's this minor limitation, which is the malicious prefix shown in orange has to end with a 0 followed by an empty line, but in general, that's not going to cause us any trouble. One other thing, you might be looking at the content length header and wondering why that says 3, when there's only one obvious blue byte of data. That's because every line in pretty much every slide actually ends with /r/n. In general, it'll be easier to use the highlighting to work out which bit is the malicious prefix rather than manually parsing all of the content length and chunk headers. So why does that chunk technique work on so many systems? I think we've got to give some credit to the specification. RFC 2616 says if you receive a message that specifies a content length and uses chunked encoding, then you should give the chunked encoding priority. And that kind of implicitly says that these messages are okay to process and they shouldn't be rejected. So what that means is if you've got a chain of servers for a given website, if any server in that chain has chunked encoding disabled, then it will just fall back to using the content length, and you'll be able to desynchronize and exploit it. So this technique by itself works on loads of systems, including possibly the majority of systems using the content delivery network Akamai. I have told them about that, so that might be changing in the near future, hopefully. But what if you want to exploit a system that isn't, where every server in the chain supports chunked encoding? Well, luckily you can still do that. All you need to do is find a way to hide the transfer encoding chunked header from one server in the chain. And there's lots of ways of doing that. For example, some servers normalize trailing white space in header names. So some will think this message is chunked, and some won't. Other servers like to grep the transfer encoding header for the word chunked, rather than tokenizing it. So they will think that message is chunked, whereas others won't, and you can desynchronize them. And there's loads of techniques that you can use to desynchronize systems. This is just a tiny sampling of them, but every technique on this slide is one that I've successfully used on a real system during this research. The ones highlighted in orange are techniques that I came up with myself that I don't think have ever been documented anywhere else. So at this point, we understand the fundamentals of how to desynchronize servers, which is a really powerful building block. But if we just try and whack a server with this building block, I can tell you with confidence we'll run into hazards and complications and waste a lot of time. So to avoid that, I've developed this methodology to guide us in a controlled manner, step by step, towards a successful exploit. First off, we need to detect when desynchronization is possible. Now, the obvious way of doing that is to send two requests to the server, where the first one is ambiguous and has a malicious prefix, and then the second one should get poisoned by the malicious prefix from the first request and get a different response. However, this technique is massively flawed, because if anyone else's request hits the server in between your two requests, then they'll get the poisoned response, they'll potentially have a bad day as a result, and you won't find the vulnerability. You'll think that server is secure. So we need a better way of doing it, and after a lot of effort, I think I've got one. How this request gets handled depends on whether the front end and back end think this message is chunked or whether they use the content length. If both systems use the content length, everything's fine, we just get a normal response from the back end straight away. If the front end looks at the transfer encoding header, it's going to read in the chunk size of 3, it's going to read in the ABC, and then it's going to read in the next chunk size, which is Q, which is not a valid chunk size, because that's meant to be a hexadecimal number. So it's just going to reject that request without even forwarding it onto the backend system. But if the front end looks at the content length header, so it forwards all the blue data, but not the orange Q onto the back end, and then the back end looks at the transfer encoding chunks header, then the back end will time out, waiting for the final chunk size to arrive. So if we send this request and we get a significant time delay in the response, that's a pretty strong indication that that server is vulnerable to request smuggling. And if the desynchronization happens the other way around, with the front end looking at the transfer encoding, we can still detect that using a similar technique. There is a small catch with that second technique, which is that if the server is vulnerable the first way round, then we end up poisoning the backend socket with the X, which might have negative side effects for someone else. So to avoid that, simply always use the technique on the left side first. Now, you should try this technique using every different desynchronization technique on the target system, and you should try it on every URL on the target server, because different URLs may be routed to different backends, and you can't always tell simply by looking at them. As of today, this technique is used by Burp Suite Scanner to find this vulnerability, and it's also used by the open source free tool that I'm releasing as part of this research. Now, because this technique is finding the vulnerability based on inference, it is going to get some false positives, but it doesn't get very many, and the real strength is it gets vastly less false negatives than the classic approach. For example, on one target, this technique found the vulnerability every single time I scanned it. And using the classic approach took 800 failed attempts before I successfully managed to replicate it. And that's potentially 800 real users who got unexpected responses. So, in an ideal world, we could stop there, but probably quite a few clients won't take a report seriously without more evidence. So that means we're going to have to fall back to using the good old, unreliable classic approach. We're going to send a pair of requests. The first one will look like this, and it has a malicious prefix designed to affect the response that the second request, shown in green, will get. So if the second request, which would normally get a 200 code, gets a 404 in this case, that proves this system is definitely vulnerable to request smuggling. There's a few key points here. One is that you should absolutely not send those two requests over the same connection yourself. If you do that, you'll just get false positives. Also, the endpoint you send these payloads to is really important, because if the backend doesn't expect to receive a post request, or if it doesn't like your request for any reason, then it may reject the request with like a 500 code, and it may also close the connection to the front end. And if it closes the connection, that means the malicious prefix in orange gets thrown out and the attack will fail. So you want to try and find an endpoint that expects to receive a post request, and also try and preserve any parameters it needs. So in these examples here, I've tried to preserve the q=smuggling parameter. Finally, even if you do all of that, you've got to remember this technique is non-deterministic. It will randomly affect other people browsing the website instead of you. And even if there is no one else browsing the website, many servers use pools of connections to talk to the backend, so you'll still probably have to try it a few times. Okay, now we're done with the theory. We can finally take a look at what damage we can do using this technique. Now, every case study in this section is a real system that I exploited during this research. I have unfortunately been forced to redact quite a few company names, partly because some of them haven't even managed to patch it yet. But I'd like to give a shout out to every company that actually does let me name them in these slides. Please remember, these are the companies that are now secure against these techniques. It's the companies that aren't named that may still be vulnerable. Also, during this section, I'm going to keep a running total of the bounties earned using each attack technique here. And as usual, of these, over 50% has been donated to charity. Probably the easiest attack you can do with request smuggling is bypassing security rules on the front end. On a popular software vendor, I found their front end wouldn't let you access /admin. But by smuggling the request, the front end thinks we're accessing the root of the server, so when we send the next request ourselves, we get access to the admin page. Right? So far, so easy. Now, lots of front ends like to rewrite requests by adding headers to them. And one header that practically every system uses some variation of is x_for, which just specifies the remote user's IP. Now, if we try and add this header to a normal request ourselves, most well-configured servers will rewrite this header or just remove it completely. But when we smuggle a request, we bypass header rewriting. So we can use that to make our IP look like it's coming from anywhere. And using that technique on a security vendor, I got an incredible $300 bounty. So I'm not suggesting you're going to get rich quick using this technique, but it works on practically every server, so it's worth knowing. And also, it has a slightly less obvious use. Imagine you've got a target website where the timeout technique works every time, so you're fairly sure it's vulnerable, but their traffic volume is so high, you've effectively got zero chance of ever getting a poisoned response yourself. How do you prove that that server is really vulnerable? Well, one way of doing it is to smuggle a request that looks something like this, but put a unique host name in the x_for URL. If you get a DNS lookup for that host name, that shows that the body of that message has been interpreted as a separate request by the backend server, and thereby proves that they're vulnerable to request smuggling. Now, IP spoofing is okay, but the really interesting behavior is going to come from custom application-specific headers. But we can't exploit those unless we know what they are. Fortunately, it's often quite easy to find out, as long as the target website has an endpoint that expects to receive a post request and reflects the value of at least one parameter. So on New Relic, I smuggled a request to their login page, and I made sure my email address was the last parameter. So that meant when I sent the next normal request, that got concatenated onto the email address that I was trying to log in with, which meant the response reflected the whole of the second request, including all of the headers that the front end had appended onto that request. And some of those headers are going to come in useful on the next slide. On New Relic, the backend system wasn't really the backend, it was actually a reverse proxy. So by changing the host header, I could access different internal systems. But all the internal systems I could find responded with this redirect to HTTPS, suggesting that they thought my request was being sent over HTTP. But by looking at the previous slide, I saw the exported proto header. So I stuck that onto the smuggled request myself, and that meant I could actually access these internal systems. And so I went exploring, and I found an endpoint that gave me a really taunting error message. It said, not authorized with header, but it didn't tell me what the name of the header that I wasn't authorized with was. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is the XNR external service header that we saw on the previous slide. But that didn't work. That actually made the problem worse. So at this point, I could have retried that request reflection technique on loads of different endpoints on New Relic until I found out the name of this header. But I was feeling kind of lazy, so instead, I decided to cheat and look at my notes from last time I compromised New Relic. And that revealed the Service Gateway account ID and Service Gateway is New Relic admin headers. So by specifying those two headers on a smuggled request, so I bypassed their rewriting, I gained access to their core internal API as an admin and as every account on their system. So I gained pretty much full access to everything and got a $3,000 bounty for that. Now, New Relic patched this really quite fast with a hotfix, but they said that the root cause of this was associated with their F5 load balancer, and I'm not sure that F5 have patched that yet, so you might want to check that out if you're using them. Now, what we've seen is with request smuggling, if you're willing to put the time in, you can break directly into internal systems and have a good time. But there's also a lot of much easier techniques that are less environment dependent, focused on attacking other users. So that's what we're going to look at next. If the application has any way of persistently storing text data, exploitation is really easy. So for example, on Trello, I smuggled a request to update my own profile bio, and I made sure the bio parameter was last, and I didn't send a follow-up. So someone else's request got concatenated on to that, and then just by browsing to my own bio on Trello, I could retrieve the whole of someone else's request, including all of their session cookies, even though they were HTTP only and secure. So this is a technique that requires no user interaction whatsoever. It's just every time I send that request, I get control over the account of anyone that's actively browsing Trello's site. And I use that on a different target that didn't have any direct storage of text, but did have a support request system. So by filing a support request, I could make it so the victim's request would eventually get emailed to my account. The primary limitation with this technique is that you can only steal data as far as the first ampersand in the victim's request, because everything after that will be interpreted as just a different parameter. And that means, in general, this technique is not very good for stealing passwords directly, which is sad. But there is an exception. If the target application submits passwords using JSON, then you probably can steal them, unless the victim's password contains an ampersand, in which case you can't. Okay. So what if you can't store requests? Well, there's a whole other branch of attack based on serving up harmful responses to users. Probably the most conceptually simple one is on one SaaS vendor that I can't name, they had reflected XSS, which is kind of an okay vulnerability by itself, but it's not very good for mass exploitation because it requires user interaction. But by smuggling a request that triggered the reflected XSS and then just leaving that on the socket, some random other person browsing the website would receive the response that was meant for me and get exploited. So that's more powerful than standard reflected XSS. It also exposes HTTP only cookies once again, and it also enables exploitation of traditionally unexploitable XSS, such as XSS in the user agent header or XSS in post requests that have CSRF tokens. While testing one target, trying to cause a redirect response, I happened to load up their homepage in a web browser with the developer tools open. And this message popped up, and the IP address looked worryingly familiar. And what was more worrying was that regardless of which web browser and which network I connected to their system from, I always got that error message. And looking through my logs, it turned out that, yep, this was my fault. I'd smuggled a request that looked something like this, and someone else's request for an image had snuck in there. So they'd got the redirect response, which is, that's not great, but it only affected one person, right? But a cache had seen that happening. So the cache had saved the redirect, and anyone who went to the homepage of the target website and tried to load this image ended up trying to load the image from my site. Now, on the one hand, this is a brilliant demonstration of how easy it is to do cache poisoning with request smuggling. It's so easy I did it by accident. But and also, you can see it's really powerful because there, I hijacked an image, but if I'd hijacked a JavaScript file, I would have complete control over their homepage, more or less permanently. That stayed in their cache for over 24 hours, even after I told them, please delete this. But on the other hand, you probably don't want this happening by accident, right? This is an undesirable side effect unless you're doing it on purpose. So what can you do to try and reduce the chance of this happening? Well, one thing you can do is try and craft a prefix that has no cache headers on the response. Another is just make sure that you send your victim requests as fast as possible. And finally, if you have a choice of front-end systems, try and target one in a geographical region that's asleep or otherwise won't be getting as much traffic, because that reduces the chance of someone else's request sneaking in front of yours. But ultimately, if they're using a cache, this is always a risk of this technique. The timing-based detection technique is perfectly safe. That won't do this, but if you try and actually prove the attack is properly vulnerable, this is a risk. Now, that wasn't ideal, but it left me wondering, what if we embrace this possibility? So here, I've sent a malicious prefix to try and fetch an API key from an account. And when the user's request gets concatenated on, that request gets completed with their session cookie. So it fetches their API key. Now, at this point, all we've done is made them receive their own API key, so that's not really very dangerous. But if they were trying to load a static file, then a cache may see that happening, and it may save their API key over that static file. So then we can just browse to, say, that JavaScript file and retrieve the victim's key. If this attack sounds kind of familiar, that's because this is conceptually very similar to web cache deception, which is a technique that was unveiled at Black Hat a few years ago. The key difference is that this technique doesn't require any user interaction. It's just exploiting a random person browsing the website. Now, unfortunately, my attack pipeline that I use to find examples for presentations doesn't log into websites. So I haven't found any genuine examples of this happening, but, I'm pretty sure it exists out there, and I think you're going to find it in those locations. If anyone does find it, I'd love to see a write-up. Now, on New Relic, their backend system was an internal proxy. And on some other systems, their backend was actually a CDN. They like chained multiple CDNs onto each other, which, I mean, I have no idea why you do that, but some of them do. And what that means is, if you change the host header, you can serve up any content that's hosted on that CDN. So on this advertising company that I can't name, if you change the host header, you can serve up content from any Akamai website on their own site. And once again, that would get cached. So you could effectively overwrite their homepage with any page on anyone on Akamai. And that same concept works on SaaS providers too. Like you can change the host header to a different client of the SaaS provider and serve up their content. Now, redhat.com was itself directly vulnerable to request smuggling. And while looking for vulnerabilities to chain in to do some damage with it, I found this DOM-based open redirect. And that raised an interesting challenge, because with request smuggling, we control what the back-end server thinks the URL is. But we don't control what the victim's web browser thinks the URL is. And this getQueryParam function is being executed in the victim's web browser. So effectively, by itself, you can't combine this issue with request smuggling. But if the target has a local redirect, then you can use that. You can chain these. So you smuggle the request to trigger the local redirect to redirect the user to the page that has the actual exploitable DOM issue and use that. So this technique can be used to combine any DOM-based issue based on the URL with request smuggling to make it exploitable with no user interaction. Now, local redirects are useful, but also with request smuggling, because we can control the host header, a lot of local redirects, a lot of redirects in general, turn into open redirects. In particular, Apache and I think some versions of IIS have a default behavior where if you try and access a folder that's a real folder and you don't specify the trailing slash, they'll give you a redirect to put the slash on there using the host header. So using this technique, you can trigger a redirect to an arbitrary system with request smuggling on pretty much any target website. And by itself, redirecting users isn't that great, but if we can redirect a JavaScript file, that lets us hijack accounts. And if we can get that redirect cached over the JavaScript file, we can take full control over the website. This technique is one of the easiest ones, and is really fast. So this became my go-to technique for exploiting websites, and I earned a decent number of different bounties using it. There's a couple of other points. One is if you get a 307 redirect, that is absolute gold. Because if someone's browser is doing a login request, so it's posting their username and password to a site, and it gets a 307 redirect as the response, it will repost that data to the attacker's website. So you can make people send their password to your website from the target's login page. Also worth mentioning is some thick clients, like HTTP libraries but that aren't browsers, have that data reposting behavior on all redirects. So for example, on a New Relic, I was able to steal some of their API keys because they were reposting data even though the status code was just 301 or something like that. Now, one of the targets this redirect-based cache poisoning technique worked on was PayPal, which made me happy. And so if we issued a request to WebStatic without the trailing slash, they would give a redirect, and we could make that redirect go to our server. However, there was a couple of complications. One is that, as you can see, the two host headers were getting concatenated onto each other, meaning that the host part of the redirect was just broken. Fortunately, that was easily fixed by sticking a question mark at the end of my host header. The second problem is that this redirect uses the HTTP protocol, not HTTPS, and I couldn't find any way to change that, which meant that when we were poisoning JavaScript files, this would get blocked by mixed content protection, except on the Safari and Edge and Internet Explorer. The details of that are in my presentation from last year. But still, that's a decent number of users. And that JavaScript file that we can permanently convert into a redirect is used on PayPal's login page. However, there's a catch. PayPal's login page also uses CSP, which blocks this redirect. But PayPal's login page also loads a different page in an iframe, a page on c.paypal.com. And that page also imports my poisoned JavaScript file and doesn't have CSP. So that means I can hijack the iframe. But I can't just read the password out the parent page because of the same origin policy. The user's browser would just block this. But my colleague Gareth Hayes found a page at paypal.com/us/gifts, which was a static page, and it didn't have CSP, and it also imported my malicious JavaScript file. So by hijacking the iframe, and by redirecting it to this /us/gifts URL, and then re-hijacking the iframe for the second time, that got me code execution on the JavaScript execution on the same domain, so I could then read the user's PayPal password out of the parent page and send it off to my website. So the effect was, if anyone wanted to tried to log in to PayPal in Edge or IE or Safari, I could steal their password with no user interaction. And PayPal paid a decent $19,000 bounty for that. Now, they fixed this really fast, and they did it by making the front-end system, which was Akamai, unsurprisingly, block any requests that had the word chunked in the transfer encoding header. And at the time, I looked at this defense, and I kind of poked it a bit, and I thought, yeah, that looks pretty sound. But a few weeks later, I was trying out a new desynchronization technique simply using a line-wrapped header. Now, this attack is completely specification compliant. I didn't really expect it to work on anything, and it pretty much didn't work on anything directly. But what it did do was expose an interesting little bug in Akamai, where if you use line wrapping, they just don't see any of the data after the new line. So when they looked at that, they thought it had a blanked transfer encoding header and passed it onto the backend server, so I could once again compromise PayPal's login page and got another $20,000 bounty. Thanks. I thought that was really generous of them, especially given that I said that the first fix was fine, and it wasn't. Okay, right, so now we've seen a whole range of different attacks. It's time for the demo. So I'm going to exploit a replica of a real system. You might even recognize it. This is a system where the real version of this holds all kinds of juicy 0 days within. And this is Bugzilla. So, firstly, I'm going to take a request to the system, and I'm going to right-click and click Launch Smuggle Probe, which is going to launch this Burp Suite extension that I'm releasing as part of this research. And here, we get loads of options. You can see there's tons of desynchronization techniques. I've just turned them all off, except for the one that's actually going to work for the sake of speed. So if I send that running, we can see the requests it's sending. And if we look at the request, you can see it's using this timeout technique that I showed you earlier. And sure enough, we're getting a timeout from the server. Now, why is this message ambiguous? You can see we've got a content length here, and there's a transfer encoding chunked header up here. But the interesting thing is this header that we've got before it. If we switch to the hex view, it'll probably be too small to see, but just believe me, this character that I've just highlighted is OA. So I've terminated this header with OA, when you're meant to terminate headers with OD OA. And that's meant that the front-end server thinks that this is one header, whereas the back-end, which is Nginx, thinks that OA by itself is terminating the header and does see the chunked content length. So that's how we're able to desynchronize it. And hopefully we found this vulnerability. Yep. So I'm going to right-click on it, and now we've got this extra option that says Smuggle Attack. Once again, this is the open source extension that I'm releasing, which works with the free version of Burp and so on. So this is going to pop open a turbo intruder window, and you don't need to worry about changing most of it. The only thing you want to change is this prefix variable. This is the malicious prefix that's going to be applied to the next request. So in this example, we're going to send the attack once and a bunch of follow-up requests that are identical, and one of the follow-ups should get a 404 status code back. And sure enough, it has. So these requests are identical, but the first one is getting a 404, and that's because in the first request, we've got this attack happening here. So that demonstrates that the system is vulnerable to request smuggling. Now we just want to try and do some damage. On Bugzilla, anyone by design can register an account and file a bug. And on a bug, you can put an attachment. And these attachments can contain HTML, but this isn't a security risk, because if you see here, the application is on bmoweb.vm, but the attachments are rendered on bmosandbox.vm. So by itself, this is not a security risk, thanks to the same origin policy. But maybe we can use that behavior with our attack. So I'm going to find the request that loads that attachment, which is here, and I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to put that in the prefix variable here. So I'm applying that as a prefix to the next request. It's important that you leave this extra header on the end, because remember, the victim's request is being stuck directly on the end of this. So if I didn't have this, the victim's request would land on the host header and it would just break the whole thing. So if I send this, the second request, here we go, should get, even though it's being sent to bmoweb.vm, it's getting our harmful HTML file back. So that demonstrates that the server is almost certainly vulnerable. All we need to do now is prove the attack. And to do that, I'm going to comment out the victim requests. So I'm going to leave the backend socket poisoned. There we go. So now, for anyone browsing the site, no matter what they click, I'll just do my dashboard, they will get this harmful response back, and it will steal their password. And that got $4,000 that bounty, taking the total to 70K during this research. Now, to fix these vulnerabilities, you have to be able to find them. And that means you need the right tooling. So whatever tool you're using, it needs to support manually changing the content length. If you have a tool that automatically updates the content length and there's no way to turn that off, you can't properly find request smuggling vulnerabilities. And also, it must not normalize requests, because once again, that will lead to you failing to find these vulnerabilities. In particular, this means that using curl to replicate this issue may cause you problems. You'll want to use like netcat and then pipe it into, use netcat or OpenSSL or something like that if you have to try and replicate this on the command line. Also, some companies like to force pen testers to attack the target site through a dedicated proxy, just for the pen testers. And this is really bad for request smuggling. For one, it will prevent you finding request smuggling vulnerabilities that really do exist. But even more amusingly, it will also introduce extra vulnerabilities that can only be used to exploit other pen testers. So please just target please target the system exactly as a normal user would be accessing it. As far as preventing these goes, the best possible strategy is for the front end to exclusively use HTTP2 to talk to all backend systems, because this is basically a vulnerability with HTTP 1.1. If that's not plausible, the next best strategy, which I have seen successfully done, is to have the front end normalize any kind of ambiguity in request, any kind of unexpected data before routing it on to the backend system, and that strategy is backed up by RFC 7230. If you're forced to try and patch this on the backend system, life's a bit more difficult. The only option you've got is that if you receive a request that could be considered to be ambiguous, you need to drop that request, like just send a 500 back, and also drop the connection, so any poison data is thrown out. There's loads of resources online. The white paper is the companion to this presentation. Also, for the first time, we've released a bunch of free intentionally vulnerable websites. So you can practice exploiting this vulnerability on real systems without risks of causing side effects for other users. The source code for this tool is online, and both of the references are well worth a read as well. So the three key things to take away are that HTTP request smuggling is real, as much as we might not want to think about it. HTTP 1.1 parsing is security critical and must be audited in servers. And detection doesn't have to be dangerous. I'm going to take 4 minutes of questions now, and if you have any more after that, you can come and speak to me at the back or chuck me an email. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. Thank you for listening. Thanks. Any questions? There's some microphones around the room.
I have a question. I'm interested to know, I haven't quite processed all. This is a lot of information, and thank you. That's really awesome. One thing that I was thinking about that you didn't talk about, I don't know if you tried or looked into this at all, is it possible to trigger somebody to initiate a request smuggling attack themselves through a request smuggling attack? So could you, for instance, cause somebody to issue a request for something that reveals sensitive information in the response and then request smuggles to somewhere else, and possibly if it's a low traffic site, you could be the one who gets affected by that and receive the response with the sensitive information. Is that, have you thought about that? Is that, am I thinking about this wrong?
I think I did, right, so the question is, can you do a request smuggling that creates a knock-on effect that makes someone else do the request smuggling on the next request? I have seen this happening, but I've only seen it happening very rarely. I think, yeah, so it is theoretically possible, but I've never been able to successfully trigger it on a real system.
Thank you.
Question over here.
Yep.
I was wondering if you know that you were detected either in the discovery or the attack phases of this kind of research, and if so, how that happened and what they did.
I didn't receive any evidence that anyone noticed that I was doing these attacks, as far as I could tell. I didn't get IP banned from it anywhere this time around. Yeah. I think that attack is probably relatively tricky to detect, and the current knowledge of it is just practically non-existent. So people wouldn't know what was happening anyway. Like, if you try and debug this from server logs, you're going to have a really hard time figuring out what on earth is happening. You're going to need, like, TCP dump to stand a chance.
Got another question. Would stricter content security policies as well as same origin policies help reduce the viability of this kind of?
Yes, CSP certainly makes exploiting this more challenging, as we saw with PayPal, and sub-resource integrity can also help make this harder to exploit, but neither of those will render it completely unexploitable.
Thank you.
One more.
Yep.
The limitation you mentioned with ending at the first ampersand, a lot of servers will normalize multi-port form requests. Did you try to see?
Yeah, I actually spent quite a long time trying to steal passwords just because it's a cool kind of concept. I didn't get anywhere with multi-part, but if I was going to suggest a topic for further research, I feel maybe if you combine multi-part encoding with unusual encodings, that kind of stuff, that you might be able to get somewhere there. Yeah.
I was curious if you explored request pipelining as either increasing determinism or either increasing your surface area.
Sorry, could you repeat that slightly nearer to the mic?
I'm curious if you've explored request pipelining for either increasing determinism or for increasing your surface area.
I have used request pipelining with it. It seemed, my experience with it is that it decreases determinism And it's also very easy to kind of end up doing the attack just on yourself, so you think it's working when it's not really working and just get really confused. So my advice would be to, most of the time, stay away from pipelining. I think that's it for time, but if you have any more questions, I'll be just at the back. Thank you.